Welcome to this training on domestic abuse, DASH and MARAC. This is the third episode in the series. I'm Dr. Krisha Patel and I'm a sexual offences examiner. If I was to ask members of the public to name different forms of domestic abuse, physical abuse would likely come up top of that list. And that's because when we talk about domestic abuse, for most people, the first image that comes to mind is that of the battered woman, and historically we have thought about domestic violence as bruises, cuts, and physical injuries. That's how domestic abuse has been portrayed in films and media. People generally have some sort of idea about what physical and sexual abuse is as forms of domestic abuse, and we looked at that in the second part of this series. In this session, we're going to learn about the forms of abuse that are often not that well understood by members of the public, but are really at the heart of domestic abuse. I'm talking about coercive and controlling behaviour, emotional abuse, and psychological abuse. Coercive and controlling behaviour and emotional abuse are concepts that are usually harder for people to understand than physical abuse and sexual abuse. So it's usually the case that there is more than one form of abuse occurring. So, for example, there could be a first incident of physical assault, but underlying that, there may have been years and years of escalating coercive and controlling behaviour, emotional abuse, and psychological abuse. And often, those parts are so insidious in nature that the victim may not themselves recognise that behaviour as abusive. And over years and years of chronic coercive and controlling behaviour, the victim may have normalised these abusive behaviours. With physical abuse, it's easy to recognise that as a criminal offence. It's always been a criminal offence to physically attack or assault another person. But coercive and controlling behaviour doesn't leave physical signs. As mentioned before, coercive and controlling behaviour, emotional abuse, and psychological abuse as a criminal offence is a harder concept to understand, as we need to understand where to draw that line between someone who is horrible, nasty, puts people down, makes negative comments, and likes to be in control of situations and make those big decisions, which is not a criminal offence, and someone who is behaving in a controlling and coercive way and emotionally abusing their partner, which is a criminal offence. And you may have many minor or low-level incidents that on its own, it may not seem like a criminal offence. But if it is a pattern of behaviour and happens repeatedly, it may reach that criminal threshold of being abusive. There is a definition of controlling and coercive behaviour, but ultimately, these decisions about when that criminal threshold for coercive and controlled behaviour is met can be difficult to make. And they are really a question of law. So that is to say, judges and jury decide on when that criminal threshold has been met. And it's not just about the abusive behaviour itself, but also the impact on the victim. And to meet this criminal threshold, the victim has to really fear that violence may be used against them, or that there will be some sort of untoward consequences if the victim does not comply. And the abusive behaviours must cause alarm or distress in the victim, and that it has a substantial effect on their usual day-to-day activities. I want you to pause the video here and answer the following questions. What is your understanding of coercive and controlling behaviour? And list some examples of what could be considered as coercive and controlling behaviour. Let's break this definition down and start with coercive behaviour. Coercion is defined as the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats. So coercive behaviour is the use of threats and force to try to make or persuade someone to do something that they are not comfortable with or that they don't want to do. Coercive behaviour is an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation, or other abuse that is used to harm, punish, or frighten their victim. Now let's talk about controlling behaviour, which is defined as a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of their means needed for independence, resistance, and escape, and regulating their everyday behaviour. These are the government definitions of controlling and coercive behaviour, but it's not the easiest way of explaining controlling and coercive behaviour to a client or to a patient. One of the best analogies I've heard of as a way of explaining this to patients is by comparing coercive and controlling behaviour to driving a car. When you are in a healthy relationship, you sometimes drive the car and sometimes your partner drives the car. But essentially, you make decisions that affect both of you in the relationship. So you decide which route to take together, or you take turns in being in charge of the wheel. If the partner in the relationship is controlling and coercive, the abuser puts the victim in the passenger seat. So the abuser is now the person who makes all the decisions about which routes to take and makes the decisions that affect both of you in the relationship. To the victim, the fact that the abuser has started to take control of things might not seem like a problem. The victim might think the abuser is being caring. They might think they are looking after me. But things can escalate in coercive and controlling behaviour. And instead of making joint decisions in the relationship, the abuser now makes rules on driving the car all the time. They make rules on when and where to drive to and how long they go there for. And when these rules are broken, the victim knows that there will be consequences. When this happens, the victim is no longer in driving seat of their own life. They are just a passenger in their own life. If things escalate and the abuser moves the victim from the passenger seat to the back seat of the car and make threats about what consequences can happen if the rules are broken, then the victim is no longer in control of their own life, even in their own home, which is the very place someone's meant to feel relaxed and comfortable to be themselves. But the victim is constantly walking on eggshells and frightened of the consequences of stepping out of line. So that is a good way to think about explaining coercive and controlling behaviour to someone who may be a victim of coercive and controlling behaviour but not recognise the signs themselves. Ask the person if they truly feel that they are in the driving seat of their own life. Now that we have defined what coercive and controlling behaviour is, let's move on to the second question, which was to list some examples of what could be considered as coercive and controlling behaviour. I will go through a few examples of coercive and controlling behaviour, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. There are many examples of what could be considered as coercive and controlling behaviour. The key part is that this is not a one-off incident, and it has to be a pattern of behaviour or a pattern of repeated incidents. So let's talk about isolating a victim from sources of support. This is really an important part of coercive and controlling behaviour because the perpetrator has to make the victim feel isolated from family and friends. They have to make the victim feel dependent on the perpetrator. And they have to make the victim feel like they would not survive alone. They have to make the victim feel like even if they wanted to leave, that they would have no one to turn to. And this is all part of keeping that victim in that controlling relationship. So how can an abuser isolate someone from sources of support? They can physically stop someone from seeing their family and friends by not letting the victim use social media to contact them, by restricting access to phones and laptops, by supervising the victim's use of phones and laptops, by preventing access to transport, by keeping away car keys and preventing access to money so that the victim physically can't drive off or take a train to go somewhere. And regulating everyday behaviour is a bit like someone micromanaging your own life. So examples of that include telling you what you can and can't wear, telling you who you can and can't talk to, telling you when you can go and what time you need to be back, telling you what time dinner needs to be ready, monitoring your phone use, monitoring your time or your money use, controlling when you can go to sleep, taking away your belongings like your phone, your laptop and your car keys, accompanying you everywhere you go so that you cannot go for a walk alone, you can't go to exercise alone, you can't even go to a medical appointment on your own. And these are just normal decisions we all make when we are in control of our lives. But if someone is in a coercive and controlling relationship, they are not in control of their own lives and they are not in the driver's seat for their own life. So their everyday behavior is being controlled by the perpetrator. Emotional and psychological abuse. I won't go into this in too much detail. There is huge overlap when it comes to coercive and controlling behavior and emotional and psychological abuse. But the most basic way to explain what emotional and psychological abuse is that it's bullying in the relationship. So that's things like constant criticism, negative remarks, humiliation, gaslighting. And that emotional and psychologically abusive behavior is designed to knock someone's self-esteem down and knock down their self-worth so that the victim believes that they are useless and worthless and won't be able to survive without their abuser. In this session, we focused on coercive and controlling behavior and emotional and psychological abuse. In the next session, we're going to talk about economic and financial abuse. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.